All right, so we talked about features of living things, and there's one that I didn't mention. There's a huge, ridiculously huge amount of it. You find living things in every environment you can think of, and a dozen that you can't. They found microscopic living things in hot rocks a mile below the surface. There are living things on the tops of the highest mountains and the depths of the deepest oceans, and all sorts of places you wouldn't even think to look. And that life is ridiculously diverse. There's a stonking huge number of varieties of living things. Mammals, of course, are animals that have a backbone and have hair and give milk to their babies. Um, there are 5,500 species of mammals known. Something like 1,500 of those are rodents, and about another 1,000 are bats. You may not sleep very well tonight, but it is true there are about 1,000 different kinds of bat in the world. There's about 10,000 known species of bird, 25,000 known species of fish, almost 100,000 species of arachnids, that is, spiders and scorpions and mites and ticks, and quite a lot of other things that generally pinch or bite or sting. Mollusks is clams and snails and squid and relatives of theirs. 85,000 species known of those. Nearly 1 million known species of insect. We know of over 1,900,000 different species of living thing. I will get a little bit later to a better, clearer definition of what we mean by species. Let's just say right now that just a definition as, basic variety of living thing will do for right now. So there's nearly 2 million basic varieties of living thing that we know about, and we continue to find more. The total number of living species on the planet of animals, but also plants and fungi and microbes, nobody really knows. It's kind of hard to count things when you don't know how many there are. That sounded more profound than I meant. The best conservative estimate that I've seen lately is somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 million species, 9 million basic varieties of animal, plant, fungus, and microbe. And it's a problem trying to keep track of them all, especially because we keep finding new ones. Roughly 18,000 new species of organism are discovered each year. This is one that was only discovered in 2020. Now, 2020 was a pretty rotten year, but we did discover a new species of mouse lemur in Madagascar. And it's warm and fuzzy and it's got big eyes. So I can't see your faces right now, but I'm imagining you all going, "Aww," to see this thing. And we did not know it was there until this past year. This is another one of the 18,000 or so new species that were described this past year. It happens to be a snake found in northern India. And 2016, about coming up on 5 years ago, this was described. This is a freshwater stingray that was discovered in Brazil. I think we have at least 2 Brazilian students here, so you may be proud that your country has a killer soccer team and beautiful stingrays, and many other beautiful things, of course. Um, there's a South American tarantula that I included. Some of you may have nightmares about it. for which I apologize, but it has got these beautiful blue patches on it. Okay, yeah, go Brazil, Eduardo. And what the heck, this was one of a spider that was discovered in 2015 that I picked because it looks a heck of a lot like the sorting hat. And there are many thousands more that are found every year. I just picked a small sample of the most photogenic ones of the past few years, but that's nowhere near um, everything that we find each year. Most of our new discoveries don't get trumpeted like this, but we are nowhere close to finding a complete list of all types of living thing on Earth. And it's a problem to keep track of them. And I want to introduce you today to how we keep track. You can't really just use ordinary language because even in American English, one type of animal might have several names. And I picked this one because some of you have probably caught it and eaten it at some point. Maybe you still do. This is a fish that can grow pretty large and is pretty delicious, that you can fish for in bodies of water in Arkansas or all over the country now. And I find when I ask students that some of you grew up calling it a brim. That's what my dad called them. Some of you grew up calling it a bluegill. Some of you grew up calling it a perch, and there's some that might know it better as a sunfish. So this one type of fish can have 4 different names, and to some extent it's regional. People in different parts of the country may call this fish by different names. Sometimes the same name can be used for different animals. Some Americans would call this thing a sunfish, but sunfish is also used for a very peculiar fish native to tropical oceans that looks like that. The ocean sunfish basically looks like a severed fish head swimming around on its own, and it looks weird and strange, but it lives perfectly well. And they're both called sunfish. And then names in ordinary language can be subject to change for, in some cases, economic reasons. This is a deep sea fish that started getting marketed in the United States in the late 1970s. It is quite delicious. You can find it at supermarkets, you can find it in restaurants, and it's marketed under the name Orange Ruffy. Because marketers decided that Orange Ruffy sounded much better than its original name, which was the slime head. So nobody's going to want to buy slime head fillets or eat, slime head in lemon butter at your local seafood restaurant. But Orange Ruffy you can deal with. I'm not sure how many people would eat Chilean sea bass if they knew that its original name was Patagonian toothfish. So common names like that can change for all kinds of reasons. And they also vary from country to country. If you're in the United States, or probably in Canada as well, the bird on the left is a robin. Saw one of these out my kitchen window just yesterday. You've seen robins around here. If you're from the United Kingdom, the bird in the center is a robin. Very different habits. American robins tend to show up in spring. British robins are commonly put on Christmas cards over there. They're an emblem of Christmas. And then in Australia, that's the bird on the right. That's also called a robin. They all have a red breast, but other than that, they don't have much in common. Not just different locations, but different habitats, different choices of food, different songs, differences in the skeleton, all kinds of differences. The only thing that they have in common is they've got red on their chest or orange. And it gets worse when you have to communicate with speakers of other languages. Science is international. There are scientists in just about every country. There are, people that study fish in most countries, and they communicate with each other. Science wouldn't function if we didn't have ways of communicating our hypotheses and experiments and discoveries to other scientists. That's something I might have missed in the first week's lectures, but it's important. Science is social. Scientists work with other scientists. And it's hard to work with other scientists when you call it a bluegill and your colleague in Russia calls it a simia jaberny solnichnik. Or your German colleague says, wait, that's a Bloyal Sonnenbarsch. Or the French guy says it's a Crape Arlequin. I don't know what you would call it in Portuguese, I'm afraid. In Spanish, it's the Mojarra Oreja Azul. Japanese, it's Burugiru. Korean and Chinese, I have no idea, and I would have to look up. But clearly, this fish would have different names in every language. So how do we all know what we're talking about? Enter the first in a parade of dead white guys. I do talk in this class on several occasions about the history of science. And I should explain, I'm not doing this to give you heroes. One of the things that we all saw, especially this past spring and summer, is very loud and angry debates sometime over history, over whether we should keep up our memorials to Civil War Confederate military figures, or to people like Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus may have bravely discovered the New World, but he was also a slave taker and childhood sex trafficker. Should we still have statues up of him, considering the misery that he caused? When I'm doing it in here, I'm not trying to give you great heroes to admire. You don't particularly have to look up to this guy, Carl Linnaeus. For the record, I'm also not going to test you on dates or even on first names. All I would expect you to recognize would be that last name, Linnaeus. I'm not trying to give you heroes. What I'm trying to do when I talk about the history of science is remind you that science is a human thing. Human beings do it. Real people do it. And sometimes they take wrong turns, and sometimes they come up with, hypotheses that don't pan out. And sometimes they argue, and sometimes they fight. And they're influenced by the societies that they live in various ways. Science isn't something you can truly separate from the rest of human society. And yeah, in the beginning part of the course, most of the people I talk about are going to be dead white guys, because in the earlier days of Western science, people who weren't white or guys didn't have many opportunities to do science. I will remedy that as we move farther on in the course. Certainly people who have been neither dead nor white nor guys have made important scientific contributions, as they do today, and we'll have occasion to talk about it as we move forward. But for right now, the first person I want to introduce you is Carl Linnaeus, lived in Sweden, died in 1778, ended up as personal physician to the Swedish royal family, and he had an ego that would not fit through a door. He saw himself as being like the Blues Brothers. He was on a mission from God, as they say in that movie, to understand the natural world. And he thought that if he could just understand how to make sense and organize all of those diverse living things that were known back in his day, he would get inside God's head, and he would understand what the creator of the universe had been thinking. He wrote this about himself in the third person. He's saying of himself, God has allowed him to see more of his created work than any mortal before him. God has endowed him with the greatest insight into natural knowledge, greater than any has ever gained. Lack of self-esteem was not one of Linnaeus's issues. There was a practical reason as well behind trying to understand God's thoughts. Linnaeus taught medicine at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And remember that your main source of drugs was plants back then and had been for thousands of years. In fact, this is still partly true today. Something like 25% of all prescription drugs that are sold in the US are either extracted from plants, or at least they were first discovered in plants, even if we make them synthetically now. As we'll see, that includes everything from chemotherapy treatments for cancer all the way down to aspirin and Sudafed. Those all have botanical origins if you go back far enough. And it was more true back when Linnaeus was teaching in the 1730s in Uppsala. Every doctor had to know botany, because if you give a sick person the wrong plant, you could end up killing the person, or at least not doing him any good. So medical schools had big botanical gardens. They were very keen on importing exotic plants from all of these new continents that had been discovered in the age of discovery, like North America. One of Linnaeus's pupils was one of the first people to study North American plants, for example, and another was one of the first to study and bring back plants from Japan. And every doctor had to know something of botany. So you have a practical need to come up with a way of indexing and organizing all of these plants, including all of the new species that are coming from these new lands that are being discovered and colonized. So you have to have some way of organizing everything. Now, Aristotle had a Greek philosopher, lived about 350 BC. He's sometimes called the father of biology because he'd written an enormous amount of learned works on science and philosophy, and he'd come up with ways to classify things. He said, okay, when we classify a group of things, let's first figure out what all members of the group share, and then let's figure out what makes each member of the group different from all of the other members in the group. So here's Aristotle himself. He belongs to the group of mankind, or humanity, because he shares features with all of humanity, 2 eyes and a nose and 2 ears and all of that. And then there are things that make him different from other members of the group humanity. He's got a bald spot, a comb over, a beard. He goes around philosophizing. He was Alexander the Great's tutor before Alexander decided he'd rather conquer the world than understand it, and so on. So if you have a group of things, you can group them based on features that they have in common, and then figure out what makes each one different from the rest. And I forget what Aristotle called these in Greek, but in Latin, the name for a group and the things that make the group members alike is their genus. And then what makes each one different from the rest is its species, related to our words generic and specific. You know, if I say that so-and-so is a generic student, what I'm saying is that person has all of the common features of all students. And if I refer to a specific student, I mean one that has features that make that student different from all others, right? Our words generic and specific go back to this. So Aristotle was very influential on everyone who came after him. And Linnaeus said, okay, let's do it that way. Here we've got three different roses. They're all roses. They've all got similar leaves. They've all got similar structures in the flowers. They've got different numbers of petals, but the same flower shape, the same petal shape, the same numbers of sex organs in the middle. They're all thorny, of course, because as Poison taught us, every rose has its thorn. Sorry, that was back long before your time. That was back in the 80s when music was still good and I was still young. But each one of these is a different type of rose. So we could say these all belong in the genus of rose, and yet each one is different from the other two in different ways. So we can say that each one is a separate species within the genus of rose. And we can talk in a little bit more detail later about exactly what we mean by species. For right now, let's just call it basic type of living thing. We can do better than that, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So Linnaeus decided that we can name species with two-part names that reflect genus and species. This is a little bit like first name and last name, except that he put them in a different order. Biological species get two-part names, and they're in Latin because at the time Linnaeus was writing, Latin was the universal language, at least in Europe and colonies, I guess, of educated people. It was the international language of scholarship. So you give each species a two-part name that's called a binomial name, and this custom is called binomial nomenclature. One word in Latin designates the genus, and then a word after that designates the species. These are all members of genus Rosa, which happens to be Latin for rose. But the one on the left, the European wild rose, is Rosa canina. And then in the middle, we have Rosa gallica, and Rosa grandiflora is the one on the right. And again, it's like, you know, I belong to a family called Wagoner. That would be my genus. And the specific Wagoner that I am in the family is Ben Wagoner, as opposed to my dad, Roger Wagoner, or his father, Joseph Wagoner, or my cousin, the composer of classical music, Andrew Wagoner, and so on. Okay, so my first name tells me what species I am, and my last name is kind of like my genus. Same thing here, except we do the order reversed. Not really critical for this class, but just so you know, we always capitalize the genus name. We don't capitalize the species name. And these are always written in italics, or if you're on a typewriter and you can't use italics, you underline them. Not really critical, but if you see this at some point in the future, that's the convention for writing binomial names. Previous scientists, instead of giving names, had long descriptions in Latin. This flower would be Rosa sylvestris alba cum rubore folio glabro. Rose of the forest, white with a red blush, smooth leaves is what that means. That's long, that's hard to remember. No two people are likely to describe things in exactly the same way. Linnaeus says, okay, let's cut that out. Rosa canina is much simpler. And to this day, we use Linnaean style names in Latin for all species. There's no law against doing anything else, but this is just international agreement among scientists, because we have to have some common way of naming species. So if I'm talking to fish specialists around the world, I don't have to worry about whether I'm saying bluegill, brim, Bloyal Sonnenbarsch, Mojarra Oreja Azul, or Sinia Jaberni Solnichnik. What we would all use is Lepomis macrochirus. Now, not every scientist has to memorize Lepomis macrochirus, but at least that's what people would look it up under. At least that's the international standard of reference for that fish. And if I was writing a paper about Arkansas fish, I would always include Lepomis macrochirus, and anybody who read it would at least have a standard name that they could look it up under and refer to it by. That solves that robin problem because those three birds have different scientific names. If I'm talking to a British specialist, I don't have to worry when I say robin what he thinks, because the American robin is Turdus migratorius, which sounds funny, but Turdus happens to be Latin for a thrush type of bird. And his robin is Erythacus rebecula. And if we're talking about an Australian robin, well, that's Petrebica phoenicia. So there's no confusion in this case because we can use these standardized Latin scientific names. Technically, the names don't have to be in proper Latin. You can even make them up. There are some names that are just arbitrary combinations of letters, and there are names that are derived from languages all over the world, but they have to be spelled and pronounceable in the Latin alphabet. They have to follow some very boring rules of Latin grammar that we're not going to get into, and they have to be unique. Sometimes it happens two species accidentally get given the same name. If that happens, one has to be renamed, and there's some rules called the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature that tell you which. The fish on the bottom is the Japanese puffer fish, whose name is Takifugu rubripes. Takifugu is the Japanese name for this fish. Up at the top, that's a fairly common tropical marine fish, lives in coral reefs and places like that. In particular, coral reefs in the Red Sea, where the locals speak dialects of Arabic. And when scientists named it, it was Abudefduf saxatilis. Saxatilis happens to be Latin for hangs around the rocks. Abudefduf is the local Arabic name for it. I believe it means father of stripes or something like that. But it doesn't matter. We can still use it as a name. We just have to spell it in the Latin alphabet. We have to pronounce it in the Latin rules, and we have to do some grammar stuff with it that you don't want to hear about. And be it said that names also don't have to be accurate descriptions. A name is just a name. This is the European swift. It spends an enormous amount of time in the air. It's an amazingly nimble flyer. It snags insects right out of the air. And you can't really see the feet on it. The feet are pretty small and tucked up under the body, so the bird can be streamlined. The bird does not spend a great deal of time perching on anything. And it was once believed that this bird didn't have any feet. Now it actually does, but it was given a name meaning no foot in Latinized Greek. This bird's called Apus apus. Apus is the Latin spelling of the Greek term for no foot. Now, it really does have feet. They're just not easy to see. I bring this up just to show that names do not have to be accurate descriptions of a species. They may be, they often do mean something descriptive in Latin or whatever language is used, but they don't have to. In theory, they could have named this bird Fijicafula mijicabula, and it would be perfectly valid as long as you can spell and pronounce it in Latin. Sorry, now I've got that stuck in my head. Bibbity bobbity bool. Right. So species that are similar all get grouped into the same genus. These are three fish that you could find in Arkansas. They're native to the southeastern United States. At the lower left, you have the bluegill. At the top left, you have the pumpkin seed. And you have the green sunfish at the lower right. They're all placed along with maybe 8 other species in the genus Lepomus. So we have Lepomus gibbosus, the pumpkin seed. Lepomus macrochirus is the bluegill. Lepomus cyanellus is the green sunfish. And there are various others that I'm not going to recite all the names. I don't think I remember most of them anyway. But we put all of these in one genus. They're all similar to each other in structure. Now, genera that are similar go into the same family. At the lower right, we've got 4 of the 12 or so members of the genus Lepomus. I can't fit all 12 on this slide, but this should be enough to give you the idea. So those 4 fish all go into genus Lepomus. The 2 fish up at the top are black and white crappie, which go in a separate genus, genus Pomoxis. You might know crappies. That's the fish that my cross the street neighbor keeps failing to catch in Lake Conway. Maybe some of you have had better luck. Down at the lower right, we've got 2 species. I think there's about 8 that I can't fit all of them on the slide. But these are examples of the genus Micropterus, commonly called freshwater black bass. That's actually a largemouth bass up at the top, and then a smallmouth striped bass, like the ones they catch up at Greer's Ferry, are actually in a different genus. They're not in genus Micropterus. But these are examples of 3 different genera. And those 3 genera are all grouped in a family called the Centrarchidae, because a group of similar genera is a family. And groups of several families go into an order, and groups of several similar orders go into a class, and groups of several classes go into a phylum, or if you're doing plants, a division. Don't worry about that. And then groups of similar phyla go into a kingdom, and groups of similar kingdoms go into a domain. Okay, that might have been a little garbled just now. I saw my connection was unstable, but here's the full way that we classify things now. The top grouping, consisting of all living things whose cells have structures called nuclei in them. We'll talk about that in next week, is the domain Eukarya. And that includes everything from mushrooms to redwoods to fish to us. We're all in the domain Eukarya. You divide the domain Eukarya into several kingdoms, and one of them is the kingdom Animalia, the animal kingdom. Animals go in there, everything from jellyfish and flatworms to fish and people. That kingdom is divided into roughly 30 subdivisions called phyla. And the phylum that this fish is in is the phylum Chordata. That's all animals that have a nerve cord running down the back, like a spinal cord. You are in the phylum Chordata. So is this fish. So are birds and lizards and sharks and Amphioxus and things like that. You can divide the phylum into several classes, and this fish happens to be in the class Actinopterygii. That's the chordates that have fins that are supported by rays. Right, if you've seen a fish fin, it's kind of delicate and very thin and flexible, but there's these regular stiff bars that hold the fin up. That's the class Actinopterygii. You are in a different class, the class Mammalia. Okay, so this fish is in the class Actinopterygii. There's many orders in that class, and the order this fish is in is the Perciformes, the perch-like fish. Within that order are many families, and this fish is in the family Centrarchidae. Within the family Centrarchidae, there are several genera, and this one is in the genus Lipomus. And within the genus Lipomus, there's about a dozen species, and this particular one happens to be the species Lipomus macrochirus. The best analogy I can think of, although it's not perfect, is command structure of the military. And I always get this wrong, and I apologize. Some of you probably know this better than I if you're military or come from a military family. But you have start with individual soldiers, and you can have a small group of soldiers called a fire team, and then several fire teams are grouped to make up a platoon, and then several platoons are grouped to make a company, and then several companies are grouped together to make, now I forget, I think it's battalion, but I could be wrong about that. And I apologize if I have gotten that badly wrong, but the point is that you can group soldiers into units at a particular level, and then higher level units contain several lower level units, just like a platoon will contain several teams and a company will contain several platoons, and so on. That's the closest analogy that you might be familiar with for how this works. Okay, real quick, I know we're running low on time. Linnaeus defined species by distinctive physical features that they have. If you look very carefully at this fish, you can see the upper jawbone on top of the mouth, and it extends back beyond the rear edge of the eye. If you draw a vertical line that just touches the back edge of the eye, then the upper jaw goes past that line. That makes this Micropterus salmoides, the largemouth bass, not Micropterus dolomieu, the smallmouth bass, or Micropterus punctulatus, the spotted bass. So Linnaeus's definition was you look for consistent and distinctive physical features, even if they are very minor physical features. They can be more minor than this. The problem is that many species, individuals can vary. Humanity varies a lot. We are all one species, Homo sapiens, but we vary in everything from skin color to hair color, hair consistency, eye color, height and weight and build, and tendency to get a sunburn and ability to digest milk, and possibility of having sickle cell trait, all these things. We're all very, very different from each other in many, many ways. These snails right here, these are all one species of Cuban snail. They're called Polymita picta, and they're all very different from each other in color and pattern, and even a little bit in shell shape. Maybe you could divide these into separate species, but it's not obvious where you would draw the line. It's not entirely clear which criteria you would use to sort these out. Do you use number of stripes? Do you use base color? And if so, where do you draw the line between, let's say, yellows and greens or blacks and browns? You know, what do you do? Well, the answer is it's not easy. The answer is there's no single feature that works to divide up a variable species like this. Linnaeus worked on what we call the morphological species concept, and morpho is just Greek for shape. And in the morphological species concept, you're defining a species by its physical features. That's ambiguous, especially if a species is very variable, if individuals vary a lot. What we now usually use is the biological species concept. A species is defined by its members' potential to interbreed. Humans come in a great many races and varieties and things like that. We're all one species because we're all potentially able to interbreed with each other and produce fertile offspring. And in fact, different varieties of human have been interbreeding with each other for as long as they have been on the planet. We all have some kind of mixed ancestry if you go back far enough. We're all one common species. All of those snails are potentially able to interbreed with each other. They're all one species. And a species is reproductively isolated from others. Members of one species can't produce fertile offspring by breeding with members of other species. There can be ambiguities and fuzzy cases in there that we're not going to have time for in this class, but the biological species concept works pretty well most of the time, kind of, sort of. Occasionally, we find species that you can't tell apart by looking. These two chickadees are physically identical. These are little birds in North America. They don't interbreed, even though they look alike. They can tell each other apart, and they don't get it on with each other. So we call these cryptic species. And that's the last thing I'm going to cover. I'll go ahead and stop the screen share and, oops, need to stop recording as